Welcome to the Trustbound Podcast. Another great episode last week. Pero it was such a master class. It wasn't even the Landa Club story that stuck most with me, but rather a quote. Pedro referenced Charlie Munger describing how Berkshire Hathaway scaled, and Munger called it a seamless web of deserved trust. That phrase has been living in my head rent free because I think it describes exactly what we're building with Trustbound. This episode hits principle one, trust before transaction, also principle two, borrow trust, principle three, which is context is currency, and also principle six, packs over pipelines. Again, four principles. Let me walk through each. So, the story of how Pedro met his co founder Gabriel, aka Chuco, is the best illustration of principle one we've had on this podcast so far. Gabriel got hired to be Pedro's boss, and Pedro wasn't thrilled. But one day they walked home in the same direction. And, instead of small talk, Gabriel started talking about his first company, how his co founders betrayed him, you know, very raw, very real stuff. He was very vulnerable, and Pedro opened up too. They talked about values, about who they actually are. And Pedro called that walk the cornerstone of their entire relationship. And years later, when they decided to start Landa, they did a 10-page co-founder questionnaire. Thanks so much, Pedro, for sharing that with me. Awesome. Appreciate it. Values, mental models, what they're like at their worst. Pedro said the act of doing it honestly built trust beyond what the answers revealed. I like to call this the white space. It's what people don't say rather than what people say. And that's principle one. Trust gets built before there's a transaction, before there's a deal, and before sometimes there's even a company. Um, it happens in unscripted moments of rawness and openness and vulnerability. That long walk, that hard question, the honest conversation nobody planned. Principle two showed up in how Pedro and I reconnected. We originally connected through a cold LinkedIn message in 2018 because of Gabriel, you know? And Gabriel and I barely knew each other. And, even Pedro and I barely knew each other. I can't remember if it was him that reached out to me or I reached out to him, but it was back in the HubSpot days. And years later, when Gabriel reached out to me about Landa, the first thing I noticed was that he was working with Pedro, and because I already had that thin thread of trust with Pedro, even though it's thin, it's there. I said yes immediately. It. I didn't negotiate. It was, there was no reason for me to say no. I didn't ask for a discount. The trust transferred through the known connection. Even though it was thin, it was real. So thinness doesn't necessarily mean uh, that something is fragile. And even thin trust is enough to open a door. That's borrowed trust. The thinnest thread of a real relationship outperforms the most polished cold outreach. And Munker's seamless web of deserved trust is really about principle three. The word deserved means earned. And it's earned through consistency, through showing up, through being the same person behind closed doors that you are publicly. That's sustained context. It doesn't reset because it's been genuinely built. And Pedro said the highest trust relationships are the ones where everything just flows. No contracts needed, no checkups. You just know the other person is solid. That's what happens when context has been maintained over time, when the thread never dropped. And now, Principle 6, again, packs over pipelines. Um, Pedro then gave us one of the clearest articulations of Principle 6 we've heard so far. He said, people move in packs. He used me as an example. I joined Landa. Through me, my friend Jose Cardenas joined. Ricardo Prado joined. My other great friend Julian Sanchez joined. All from my time at Mellon. All people I trust. Each brought their own connections. Actually, I met Ricardo, and we talked about this in the podcast, in my HubSpot days. And that pack moved to, to Mellon. And then that pack grew bigger. And then that pack moved to Landa, right? That's the most special. That's how trust networks grow. Not blast campaigns. One trusted person vouching for the next. Each layer inheriting trust from the one before. I want to repeat that. Trust networks grow, not because of blast campaigns, but because one trusted person vouches for the next. So, two things to apply from Pedro's episode. First, create space for long walks. It doesn't necessarily need to be physically a long walk with somebody, but create the space for that relationships. Dinners with no agenda, calls where you ask how someone's actually doing, right? Those are where uh, uh, principle one lives and thrives. And second, identify your packs and identify your pack leaders. The people who, when they move, bring others. Invest in them, but not just invest in them disproportionately. Obsess about these friends, these people, these leaders, and these packs. Because you're not investing in one person, you're investing in a network that doesn't exist yet. If this resonated, pay attention to where trust has already been doing the work for you. That's where momentum starts. Learn more at itoguide.com. See you next time. I'm Mauricio Suarez, and this is the Trustbound Podcast.